Hello, I'm John Nichols, and I was an English GP or family doctor for 42 years in a town called Guildford, which is near London. So I don't see patients anymore, but I keep pretty busy writing and doing research. And today I have a question for you, which I'd like to share with you. And here it is. Why do we grow old? And what, if anything, can we do about it? Well, there's no simple answer to this, as you may suspect. But here are a few theories about aging. Let's consider what we're dealing with. Is it just general wear and tear? That was thought to be the reason for aging for hundreds of years, but we now know that it's much more complicated. To begin with, ever since the discovery of DNA, we've realized that over a lifetime, you do accumulate mutations, some of which are adverse, and they can cause neoplasms, new growths. Some neoplasms are cancers, but most of them are relatively harmless pimples and blemishes on the skin and similar little things internally. Next, there's the theory of oxidative stress. And you may have a better idea of what's meant by that if I explain that for many years in the 70s and 80s, it was thought that you could take antioxidants to slow down aging. Well, the fact is that they don't work as well as expected. But oxidative stress is important, and it's unavoidable because we provide energy by burning up fuel with oxygen. If you're an animal, you can't avoid that. It is a metabolic cycle, and it spins off some small unpleasant molecules called free radicals that can cause tissue damage and contribute to aging. However, our body and blood is full of natural antioxidants that usually quench the free radicals and prevent this level of oxidative stress. But oxidative stress can still cause inflammation, and other causes of inflammation are infection, injury, allergy. There are various reasons why inflammation might be a problem. It is a normal response of the body to these factors, and yet sometimes it gets out of control, and it can be accelerated by environmental factors such as smoking and pollution. So when it gets out of control, the small hormone-like molecules called pro-inflammatory cytokines that mediate the allergic response and the inflammation can cause a cytokine storm, an excessive amount of cytokines. And in fact, some infections, some microbes intentionally cause a cytokine storm, which damages tissues and helps the infecting organism to spread. And of course, the one that we're all talking about is the coronavirus. So a cytokine storm as part of a bad coronavirus infection can cause a lot of damage. My old granny used to say, I grow old by jerks. And such a coronavirus infection with a cytokine storm would be one such jerk, which would cause you to age 10 years in a few months, shall we say. Number 4 is programmed aging. I suppose it's a familiar concept that we are programmed to grow old and die to make way for the next generation. But that's not quite how it works. To begin with, you have to understand about telomeres. Now, telomeres are little twists of DNA at either end of each chromosome. And as the cells divide and the chromosomes divide to repopulate the new cell, they unwind a little bit with each cell division until when the telomere unwinds completely, the cell cannot divide any further. It just sits there. It's a senescent cell. And senescent cells are more of a disadvantage. They do nasty things. They produce cytokines themselves. And this is a nice photomicrograph, a real-time micrograph of a dividing cell, which has highlighted the telomeres. Here they are, little dots at either end, actually twists of DNA at either end. And here is, that's on my cheek, it's a close-up of my cheek, which is a blemish. And this will have started, and this is about telomeres, will have started with a melanocyte, a pigment-producing cell, somewhere around about there, that mutated and started to divide rather rapidly and a little bit out of control. Now, these melanocytes produce skin pigmentation, and they're more active in people with browner colored skin, as you might expect. So in this case, the mutant melanocyte cells spread out into a rough circle, and after about 44 divisions, they ran out of telomere and they just stopped. So you can see how this can act as a failsafe. This sort of blemish is called a lentigo, and if that failsafe hadn't worked, if it hadn't stopped dividing at 44 and had gone on dividing, that would have been a cancer. It would have been a lentigo maligna. However, in this case, they stopped dividing and they're just sitting there doing not a lot. They're senescent cells, except as I say, they do produce cytokines. Alternatively, you can have an immortal cell line, and these were cells taken from the cancer of an American lady, Henrietta Lacks, in 1951. It's a cervical cancer, and sadly, she died soon afterwards. But her cells are immortal, so a bit of Mrs. Lacks lives on and is potentially immortal, because as cancer cells, they have found some way of bypassing this fail-safe of the telomeres. They either regenerate their telomeres or they find some way of bypassing it altogether. And they just carry on dividing immortally. And they are used all over the world. Mrs. Lack's cancer cells are used for tissue culture, for isolating viruses, and for doing research all over the world. Let's go on to the next, our fifth theory of human aging, which is called antagonistic plyotrophy. Now, that's a bit of jargon that I guess most of you have never heard. So I will explain that. What it means is that survival genes of your youth turn against you in middle life, which at first seems a bit unusual, and yet it does make sense. Think of them as turncoat genes, because they are a problem. In our Stone Age ancestry, and we're still genetically Stone Agers, a child who is subjected to drought and famine, as frequently happened in the Stone Age, will survive with the help of these genes, survive into adulthood and produce children, and the genes therefore will carry on being spread around the genetic pool because they're survival genes. But unfortunately, the very same genes, when you reach middle age, after which time you've done your jobs, you've produced the next generation, remember, they turn nasty. They can produce problems like obesity, diabetes, and maybe even cancer. And lastly, but perhaps most important of all, a story of sex and death. Now, it's remarkable how often the theme of sex and death recurs in fiction, in poetry, in literature generally. Sex and death, but in science, let's ask the expert what he means by this. And the expert in this case is Sir Peter Medawar, one of the leading medical scientists of the 20th century, who died in 87. He said, the force of natural selection decreases once an organism reaches an age where it has had some opportunity to reproduce. I would take it a little further and explain it like this. Natural selection continues to operate on parents, keeping them fit and capable until the young of a species are independent, which explains why humans start to age at around 40 years. Things then start to unravel. Or to put it another way, the genetic program that you're born with rolls along through childhood, helping you to grow big and strong and get cleverer, into adolescence and sexual maturity, and increasingly strong and capable, being sexually mature, producing the next generation, and raising them until they're independent by about the age of 40. And then the genetic program can no longer be supported by natural selection. That's job done. And our genetic program unravels. And that is what human aging is. It's the unraveling of the genetic program once the job of reproduction has been completed. There is one exception, and that is the grandmother hypothesis. Human females and no other mammals except killer whales or orcas have a menopause. The evolutionary advantage of this is that rearing a human child takes at least 15 years and is a very labor-intensive process. The help and support of a grandmother who has no young children of her own, compared with elephants, for instance, who have no menopause, the help of this grandmother is a major benefit. And so far as the grandmother is concerned in genetic terms, she is helping to establish her genes in a third generation. And I do like this diagram, which shows the relationship between reproduction and death. And sexual maturity here is noted by a red S. So here we have, for instance, sexual maturity of the giant tortoise at the advanced age of 40. Now, bear in mind, the giant tortoise is a cold-blooded reptile, so its metabolism is slow, everything goes slow. It reaches sexual maturity at 40 and then starts reproducing and carries on doing that well past its 100th birthday and probably lives to be about 150. And that's an average death age for the giant tortoise. Human beings, on the other hand, are warm-blooded, faster metabolism, more oxidative stress, therefore, sexual maturity in the late teens or early teens, and then keeps reproducing up to the age of 40. And with modern medicine, goes well beyond that to the age of 80. In a country with a good health service like England, where I live, this is a common age for grandmothers and grandfathers. Elephants, on the other hand, they mature at the age of 12, and therefore they don't live quite so long. Cats mature at 6 months and then get cracking, having litters of kittens and doing a good job of reproducing themselves. And having done that, the cats, you can see elderly cats around about the age of 12, looking rather sorry for themselves and elderly, and then dying in their sleep. And that's nature. 6 months for cats, 6 weeks for mice. They mature very early and they have a very rapid metabolism. Have you ever seen a laid back mouse? No, they are little twitchy, timorous things, and they're looking around, and they've got a very rapid metabolism, a very rapid heart rate, and that they mature very early, burn out and die once they've done their job of reproducing themselves. Earwigs, so short that I couldn't get the S in, that they reach sexual maturity in a matter not of weeks, but days, and many other insects too. And earwigs are, in fact, one of the longest lived insects. I've got a soft spot for earwigs because the mother earwig does look after her young, which is unusual also in insects. So now let's consider, having defined what we're up against, what can we do about it? How can we improve on our Stone Age legacy? Or to put it another way, how to improve on Mother Nature's plan for us? Well, there are two theories of aging and how to control aging that I will put to you, and they both have their merits. First of all, another great medical scientist of the 20th century, Sir Richard Doll, who died as recently as 2005, he believed that there were 10 or more individual causes of aging, and because they were different, they had different solutions. Want to avoid lung cancer? Don't smoke. Want to avoid skin aging? Don't overdo sunbathing. Want to avoid loss of muscle bulk? Exercise regularly and eat a sensible diet, and so on and so forth. He believed you find the cause and then you have a good chance of finding the answer, the solution. However, Professor Mikhail Blagosklony from New York says, no, there's a single cause of aging, and that single cause relates to all the different aging phenomena. If you can do something about that single cause, you can increase lifespan considerably. And he has shown this in his laboratory. He has shown that there is a single cause, the mTOR pathway, which is controlled by a single gene. And if you silence that gene, you can double lifespan in the nematode worm, not in the human. And the drug he used for that is rapamycin, which is still involved in research of rapamycin. So now let's compare the two professors, Professor Doll and Professor Blagosklony, because there's probably some truth in both theories. So Professor Doll would say, come on, cancers have many different causes, and you can't nail it down to one particular cause. All cancers get commoner as you get older, but there's cigarette smoke, there's dietary factors, there's radiation, etc., different causes and different solutions. And people are so different, they age differently. You can be robust and muscular, but start to go up top. You can get dementia, even though you're otherwise healthy, or vice versa. You can be frail, but mentally sound. So this is very different, and we must have different solutions. The best evidence for a single cause, come on, it's in the nematode worm, and there's no human evidence. Well, not yet anyway. The many causes, drug treatment does dominate current practice. The classic example is pills for high blood pressure, but there are many other examples. Pills that control platelet numbers after coronary thrombosis, for instance, pills that control inflammation, pills that control blood sugar, etc., etc. There's a pill for every ill. In favor of Blagosklony, I'll get it right in a minute, Blagosklony, he says, we have a single gene explanation in the nematode worm, and sooner or later, we're going to find something similar in humans. Also, he could point out that severe dietary restriction in lab rats slows aging-related changes globally, right across the board, all those different age-related changes, and nearly doubles lifespan. That's okay in lab rats. You can't really do it in humans for three reasons. Firstly, it'd be like putting people in a concentration camp. And secondly, it only works if you start it when they're very young, and I can't see that ever happening. And thirdly, people just wouldn't put up with it anyway. And now, lastly, several genes have been discovered that control aging in lab animals and are being researched. Also, found in humans is a good candidate, which is the SIR1 gene. Now, the research on the SIR1 gene was promising initially, but some of the later research was rather disappointing. So that might not be the answer, but it's a possible pointer in the right direction. So let's look at strategies to slow the aging process. First, currently applicable. Obviously, lifestyle factors, diet, exercise, non-smoking, avoid illegal drugs. Anybody who tells you that cannabis is okay, it's a natural substance and it's not as bad as tobacco, it's not true. It is very similar to tobacco and it accelerates aging, as do most illegal drugs and overuse of alcohol. Maintaining bone density and muscle mass is crucial. If you do that, you will stay fit, generally fit, not just more active, but generally fit for much longer. So the diet and exercise you get are very important, and in particular 3 nutrients, calcium, magnesium, and vitamin D. Now, calcium, magnesium in your diet, but vitamin D you get mainly from sunlight, and the amount of sunlight you get and how high it is in the sky, pretty important. So in the winter months, you can't make your own vitamin D, and it's a good idea to take vitamin D tablets through the winter months. In the UK, it is official government policy that everybody should take a vitamin D supplement through the winter months. The anti-diabetic and antihypertensive drugs have made an enormous difference in increasing average lifespan. And I think in particularly the antihypertensive drugs, but certainly the two together have made an enormous contribution to this extension of life to the age of 80 or 90. To minimize inflammation and cytokine production is a key factor in increasing age lifespan, and a lot of that is still a research issue, but nevertheless, 2 examples, metformin, a drug which was originally discovered in the late 60s when I was a medical student, has now been found to block cytokine production to some extent, and in other ways it seems to be an anti-aging drug. It's being researched. And another substance is omega-3, which minimizes cytokine production. So omega-3's got many things going for it, and that's just one. Avoid radiation. That's mainly ionizing radiation and not the electromagnetic radiation, telephone masts and things like that. Let's set that on one side, it's a different issue, not for today. But ionizing radiation, excess sunlight, which causes skin aging, no unnecessary x-rays, and please, no holidays in Mars. Don't go to Mars for your summer holidays. It's a very bad idea. I'm very much against Martian holidays. The solar radiation there is absolutely appalling. So all of these also reduce cancer risk. Now let's look at future possibilities, research that is ongoing, not yet put into practice. First of all, gene silencing. We've already come across rapamycin for gene silencing. It is crucial you get just the right dose to silence a gene without having a toxic effect. So that research is ongoing. Drugs that block inflammatory cytokines. We've already mentioned metformin, and watch this space. It's not decisive yet. Research is ongoing on metformin and related drugs. Gene editing has come in so recently, but made a big difference. Some miracle cures for gene editing. What about aging? Well, the CRISPR-Cas9 technique to delete faulty genes and replace them with healthier ones has been used in mice to increase lifespan by cutting out a faulty LMNA gene and replacing it with something healthier. And that is, again, ongoing research in mice. And most important of all, I think, is the idea of blocking or deleting senescent cells like these cells here that are just sitting there making a nuisance of themselves, producing cytokines and other nasty chemicals that help to drive the aging process. And we have one example which is being researched, the BCL2 gene inhibitor, navitoclax, which is affects cell signaling, or natural substances that influence cell signaling, resveratrol, which is found in red wine. But remember, not too much of that because there's alcohol in it as well, and only a small amount of resveratrol. Quercetin is found in onions, and that also has a similar effect on these senescent cells. It encourages them to self-destruct, a process called apoptosis, where they self-destruct without causing any damage to surrounding cells. And last but not least, spare part surgery. Not my area. I've never been a surgeon, but I know that hip and knee replacements have given people a new lease of life, including my parents, who are now no longer with us, sadly. But without hip and knee replacements, many people would be cripples and old before their time. So that's just the beginning. I think spare part surgery has got a big future to it. Now, here's a nice diagram from the man himself, Professor Blagosklony. And first of all, look at line A. This is the situation before modern medicine. You develop overt disease in your 40s, you stagger on till about the age of 50, and then this terminal phase, which is so short, there's no words in it, but the terminal phase was pretty quick. And many people died in their 50s and 60s, in the Middle Ages, for instance. Then modern medicine came along, and we found all sorts of ways of controlling overt disease, things like high blood pressure and coronary artery disease, and many cancers which can be cured. And so this overt stage was stretched out, and the terminal stage too, with modern drugs, can be stretched out so that many of us are still around in our 80s and 90s, which is good, particularly if you have grandchildren. Now, what about the future? And this is what Blagosklony has predicted. We will stretch out the pre-disease phase. Remember, you'd have to start treatment relatively early in life to do this, by dealing with these senescent cells, by manipulating gene expression and gene silencing of the turncoat genes, for instance, all sorts of possibilities here. And even the overt disease stage might be stretched out a bit until finally, having started to age, maybe in your late 70s or 80s even, you finally, you go on past your 100th birthday and you may live to be 160. Well, that's pretty amazing, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. I can't see it happening in my lifetime or my children's lifetime, but maybe in the lifetime of my grandchildren. Time will tell. I thought it might be interesting now to go through 10 tips I found on the internet. Most of them were on our UK National Health Service advice page on how to avoid cancer and slow aging. And you'll find some of these are familiar, but I'll just go through them. Stop smoking, cut back on alcohol, cut back on red meat. Eating too much red meat generates carcinogens and other chemicals that are not so good for the aging process. Our ancestors certainly probably ate a lot of red meat, but also a lot of fish. Cut back on processed meat. Well, we'll go into that, why that is later, but something unnatural about processed meat. Drink green tea and eat 5 or more helpings of fruit and vegetable a day at a minimum. green tea will go more into that. Respond to screening invitations, such as for cervical cancer, breast cancer, and bowel cancer. Don't say, oh, it'll never happen to me, or I don't like the thought of doing that. That's a bit yucky. That's a big mistake, and I've seen people come across through making that mistake. If you respond to these screening invitations, you can catch them when they're absolutely tiny and can be easily eliminated. And that too, I have seen many times. It works well. Exercise enough to make you sweat 3 times a week. So many advantages to that. Healthy body, healthy mind, low risk of dementia. It goes on and on. So many good things about that. Take a daily probiotic now. That was not on the NHS website, but I have read a lot about probiotics and I've done some research in that area. And I'm convinced that a daily probiotic reduces your risk of cancer and probably helps you to live longer generally. Avoid excessive radiation. We've covered that already, including the ultraviolet. Get vaccinated against hepatitis B and human papillomavirus. And that was on the NHS website. I would also say, of course, get vaccinated against coronavirus, against flu. All of these help you to live a longer life. But hepatitis B and papillomavirus are obviously more specifically related to cancer and preventing it. Practice safe sex and avoid needle shearing, as the HIV virus is associated with a greater increased risk of severe cancers. I would like to emphasize that nowadays, if you're just HIV positive and you get early treatment, you can live a normal lifespan. Now let's look at diet in a bit more detail. And on the left-hand side is the good, and on the right-hand side is the bad. And maybe some things you rather like on the right-hand side, so I'm sorry about that. But there's some nice things on the left side. There's some nice veg and fruit and tomatoes and spices and herbs and a bit of garlic. They're all to the good. Mostly they both decrease the risk of cancer and they help to increase your lifespan. On the other hand, there are people who have another glass and another glass are making a mistake. One glass should be enough. We'll go more into why these processed meats are a bad idea. And this rather odd picture is a picture of barbecued meat, which is being burnt to a frazzle. So let's look at this in more detail. Okay, so the cruciferous vegetables contain sulfur-based glucosinolates. Have I got that right? Glucosinolates. Found in broccoli, cabbage, watercress, etc. All these sort of veggies. During cooking and chewing, the glucosinolates are chemically converted into active ingredients, the indoles and isothiocyanates. As I said, they're sulfur-based chemicals that have a dual anti-cancer effect. Firstly, they help to accelerate detoxification of carcinogens in the diet, and you can't avoid carcinogens completely, and particularly overcooked meat will contain a fair share of carcinogens. And secondly, they have a direct killer effect on cancer cells. Is this apoptosis again, this auto-destruct process that cells go through. So they encourage the cancer cells to auto-destruct. And in green tea, there are catechins that inhibit the rapid growth of small blood vessels needed to sustain a cancerous growth. Lycopene is in the tomatoes, and that has an especially good effect on the prostate. It shrinks prostate cancers. It does this by neutralizing the free radicals that are generated in the prostate and cause the DNA damage that leads to cancerous changes. It just so happens that although the tomato doesn't produce lycopene for our benefit, but for its own benefit, that the lycopene tends to settle in the prostate and in the first place reduces your risk of prostate cancer. And if you already have prostate cancer, it helps to shrink it. Moving to the right-hand side, excess alcohol, amongst other things, blocks the absorption of vitamin B9, which is folate, and the pharmaceutical version, that is folic acid. In diet, it's folate, and it's essential to DNA synthesis in the cells of the gut lining. It's essential to DNA synthesis throughout the body, but particularly in the gut lining. As DNA synthesis carries on, as the cells of the gut lining are dividing and replacing the top layer all the time as it shears off, as skins do. So skins always have to have a lower layer that is replacing the top layer that flakes off. And in this case, it's a pretty rapid turnover. So with DNA synthesis going wrong due to lack of folate in the diet, there are copying errors, and some of those copying errors will be mutations that cause cancer, bowel cancer. Now, let's move on to the overcooked meat, as we saw on the barbecue. You get a chemical process called pyrolysis, which generates heterocyclic amines and other chemicals which are cancer promoters. So beware of overdoing overcooked meat. Some people like to have their well-cooked meat every day, and that's not a good idea. It's okay once or twice a week, but just be careful. Nearly all processed meat contains, from the traditional curing process, nitrites, and nitrites are cancer promoters. They work with other carcinogens to encourage cancers in various parts of the body. So processed meats, occasional treat, a nice bit of ham, that's fine, but just not too often. So in summary, aging is related to unraveling of the genetic program. Once the organism reaches an age when reproduction is normally successfully achieved. So it's that unraveling of the genetic program is what aging is all about. Aging and cancer are, remember, closely related. The older you are, the more likely to have cancer. The faster you age, the bigger the risk. But however healthy you are, the older you get, the bigger the risk. Cancer treatment is nowadays, luckily, much more effective. But cancer survivors may be left with problems. They may be left with generally poor health after chemotherapy and need to pay strict attention to diet and lifestyle in the future, because when you've had one cancer, you're always more likely to have a second one, statistically speaking. So you have to be very careful if you survive the cancer, otherwise you're asking for trouble. Now, we've established there are both lifestyle and medical strategies to slow down aging. And this is, on the whole, the best we can do at the moment. But research is ongoing to modify this unraveling of the genetic program which occurs from middle age onwards. And we can, in the future, perhaps find ways of modifying genetic expression of turncoat genes, senescent cells, etc., etc. The research is ongoing. In my opinion, deletion of senescent cells may be the most promising line of research, but time will tell. If you want to know more about aging, cancer, evolution, and nutritional medicine, have a look at my website. There's a lot on it, and including excerpts from my 2 books on nutritional medicine And indeed, in this book, the bigger of the two, there's a whole very long chapter on diet and aging. So that's me done. So I bid you goodbye.